When you say that something is wrong, what do you mean? In other cases, if you say that something is black or square, you know what that means. But what does wrong mean? C.L. Stevenson has a theory that he calls an emotive theory of ethical terms. And I'll be looking at that account in this video. I'm going to give away the ending. Stevenson's going to defend a theory that says that a claim like drunk driving is wrong basically has two parts. The first part of the claim says something like, I have an emotional attitude of disapproval towards drunk driving. The second part adds, you should also have an emotional attitude of disapproval towards drunk driving. Let me try to make this a bit clearer with an analogy. When you put broccoli on a plate in front of a child, the child might say, yuck, and turn up their nose. Moral statements, according to Stevenson, are like that. They're expressions of approval or disapproval. But that's not all they are. The child who says yuck when confronted with broccoli is expressing an attitude of disapproval, but the child is not making a moral claim. In the case of moral claims, the expression of disapproval at what's being done is accompanied by an expression of approval at the idea of everybody having the same attitude. Somebody who says that breaking a promise is wrong is at the same time expressing an attitude of disapproval towards breaking a promise and encouraging everybody else to adopt the same attitude towards similar types of actions. A moral expression doesn't just express approval of others having the same attitude. It attempts to bring it about that others have the same attitude. Moral expressions are a way of changing other people's minds about things and creating in others the attitudes that one is expressing. It's what Stevenson calls the dynamic purpose of ethical claims. This, then, is the theory that Stevenson will be trying to defend. Before beginning his defense, he tells us what a good theory of meaning of ethical terms must accomplish. Generally, an account of the meaning of ethical terms has to make sense of the use of ethical terms in regular conversation by regular people. Another analogy. An account of the meaning of the term green has to make sense of how we use the term green in regular conversation. If one tries to define green as a shape having four sharp 90-degree corners, this is a poor theory of the meaning of green. It may be a good theory of the meaning of rectangles, but that's something different. So how do we use ethical terms? What are the features of its use that a good theory has to account for? One feature of our use of ethical terms that a theory has to account for is the fact that we engage in vigorous debate about what's right or wrong. Stevenson writes, quote, in the first place, we must be able sensibly to disagree about whether something is good, end quote. For example, some people claim that women have a right to seek abortions, and others claim that abortions ought to be prohibited. And they argue about it. They bring up evidence. They try to persuade each other that their view is correct and that the other view is mistaken. Stevenson claims that this requirement to make sense of moral disagreement defeats what he calls interest theories. Interest theories of the meaning of moral terms are theories that reduce value claims to the likes and dislikes, the interests of the speaker. If I say that I like broccoli and somebody else says that they don't like broccoli, we're not having a disagreement. It would be like me saying that I'm 6 feet tall and somebody else claiming that they're 5'9". Both statements can be true, and there's no disagreement. Since a claim about wrongness is a claim about which people can disagree, it can't be just an expression of one's own likes and dislikes. Stevenson's second requirement is that a person only calls something good if they favor it in some way. Again, it's also the case that people only call something wrong if they disfavor it in some way. In Stevenson's words, quote, a person who recognizes X to be good must, ipso facto, acquire a stronger tendency to act in its favor than he otherwise would have had, end quote. This requirement, according to Stevenson, rules out theories that relate values to the attitudes of a group. Cultural relativism, for example, calls something good if a culture approves of it. This means that it would call slavery good if the culture approved of slavery. Now, if cultural approval was a part of the meaning of ethical terms, then it would be nonsensical for somebody to say, my culture approves of slavery, but it's still wrong. This would be like saying my culture approves of slavery, but my culture disapproves of slavery, a nonsense statement. People calling something good or bad, according to Stevenson, are expressing their own disapproval or approval. They're not making claims about the culture. Stevenson's third requirement is that the goodness of something can't be discovered using the scientific method. Values are something quite distinct from and outside of the realm of scientific investigation. Stevenson writes, quote, "We must be using some sense of good which is not definable relevantly in terms of anything scientifically knowable. That is, the scientific method is not sufficient for ethics," end quote. Now we have two questions to ask in assessing Stevenson's account. First, are these in fact requirements for a definition of value terms such as good and wrong? Second, does Stevenson's account meet these requirements? I want to put aside the first question until the next video and focus on the second. How well does Stevenson's own account fit these criteria? To explain how his own theory fits these criteria, Stevenson gives us a distinction between what he calls the descriptive purpose of a statement and its dynamic purpose. The dynamic purpose of ethical claims will be important. But what is this dynamic purpose? We're all familiar with descriptive purpose. Statements are used to describe the world. They report some fact. There's milk in the fridge. I have a dentist appointment tomorrow. The speed limit is 35 miles per hour. These are descriptive. They are true or false depending on whether they describe the world correctly. In addition to the descriptive purpose, Stevenson reports the following, quote, "On the other hand, we use words to give vent to our feelings," interjections, or to create moods, poetry, or to incite people to actions or attitudes, oratory, end quote. For purposes of this discussion in this video, it's the incitement to action or attitudes that will take center stage. Stevenson uses the example of somebody stating, "I want you to close the door." People rarely say something like this just to report some fact about the world, that they have a particular want or desire. The speaker makes the utterance with the intent of causing the listener to do something. In this case, the words are uttered to bring it about that the listener closes the door. Questions usually have a dynamic purpose. The question, "Where are the restrooms?" usually aims to bring it about that the person being asked provides directions to the restrooms. Now, according to Stevenson, moral claims have a dynamic purpose. Their purpose is to bring it about that others change their attitudes towards something. Specifically, the purpose is to get them to adopt some attitude, an attitude that will then make it more likely that they'll perform acts of the type being called good and avoid performing acts of a type being called bad. As Stevenson wrote, quote, "When you tell a man that he oughtn't to steal, your object isn't merely to let him know that people disapprove of stealing. You are attempting, rather, to get him to disapprove of it. Your ethical judgment has a quasi-imperative force which, operating through suggestion and intensified by your tone of voice, readily permits you to begin to influence, to modify his interests," end quote. So now, let's see if this meets Stevenson's three requirements. To see how this fits Stevenson's criteria, note that dynamic purpose is not subject to scientific investigation. The statement, "I want you to close the door," has a descriptive meaning that can be discovered. It describes a fact about the speaker, that the speaker has a particular desire. This is something that can be true or false. The dynamic purpose, bringing it about that the listener closes the door, is not contained within its descriptive meaning. But it is a part of the meaning of the sentence. When uttered in a particular context, listeners are very much aware that it involves a request or perhaps a command to close the door. So let's see if Stevenson's theory meets this criteria of what he called magnetism. Recall, Stevenson wrote, quote, "A person who recognizes X to be good must ipso facto acquire a stronger tendency to act in its favor than he otherwise would have had," end quote. Well, somebody isn't going to seek a dynamic purpose of getting another person to close a door or to adopt an attitude unless they have some reason to make it the case that the other person closes the door or adopts that attitude. Similarly, a person isn't going to call something wrong unless one sees some value in bringing it about that others have an attitude of disapproval. And last, we have Stevenson's criteria that a successful theory of the meaning of ethical terms must account for the possibility of disagreement. The dynamic purpose of a moral assertion is to promote an attitude of approval or disapproval, to make it the case that we all approve of that which is being called good or disapprove of that which is being called bad. In the case of disagreement, we have one person promoting a universal attitude of disapproval, while another person is promoting a universal attitude of indifference or approval. We can't have both universal disapproval and indifference, so we have conflict. Stevenson allows that moral disagreement is different from scientific disagreement. He writes, quote, "We must distinguish between disagreement in belief, typical of the sciences, and disagreement in interest. Disagreement in belief occurs when A believes P and B disbelieves it. Disagreement in interest occurs when A has a favorable interest in X, but B has an unfavorable one in it, and when neither is content to let the other's interests remain unchanged." End quote. So, if one person is seeking to realize a state in which everybody has an attitude of disapproval of capital punishment, while the other is seeking to realize a state in which everybody has an attitude of approval, there's room for conflict. This conflict can very much include, for example, disagreement over descriptive claims, such as those concerning the effect of capital punishment as a deterrence. And our disputants can bring up the compatibility or incompatibility of this value with other values, such as respect for life, or a disapproval of killing. In this, we can account for much of what people say when they have a moral disagreement. Again, at this point in our discussion, we're looking at the question of whether Stevenson's theory meets his own criteria for a successful theory of the meaning of ethical terms. It must allow for the possibility of disagreement. It must explain the fact that those who call something morally good or bad are disposed to promote or discourage its valuation, and the theory must be compatible with the inability of science to come to moral decisions. Where the dynamic function of moral claims is to promote approval, this purpose is not a matter for scientific investigation, since scientific investigation merely describes the world. Next, people don't perform actions whose function is to bring about universal agreement unless they endorse universal agreement. And finally, people can have meaningful disagreements over which values are to be made universal. So it seems that Stevenson's theory meets his own criteria for a successful theory of the meaning of ethical terms. But we set aside the question of whether those criteria are the correct criteria for such a theory. And that question will be addressed in the next video.